In the winter of 1958, a fleet of whaling ships working the warm coastal waters off Brazil packed up its harpoons, filled its holds one last time, and turned for home. Behind them, in a stretch of the South Atlantic that a century earlier had churned with whales, there were almost none left. The humpback population that fed and bred along that coast had been ground down to somewhere around 450 animals. 450. In an ocean that had once held an estimated 27,000 of them. And the South Atlantic was not unusual. It was the rule. By the middle of the 20th century, across nearly every ocean on Earth, the humpback whale, a creature the length of a bus, a singer, a migrator, an animal that had moved through the seas for millions of years, had been hunted to the ragged edge of disappearing. In the southern hemisphere alone, well over 200,000 humpbacks were killed in a few short decades. Some populations lost 97, 98, 99% of their numbers. The animal was, for all practical purposes, vanishing. And then something happened that almost nobody predicted. Not the recovery, although the recovery is extraordinary, and I will get to it. The thing nobody predicted was what the whale's absence had quietly done to the entire ocean, and what their return is now beginning to undo. Because it turns out that when you remove the great whales from the sea, you don't just lose a magnificent animal. You switch off a process that fertilizes the ocean, feeds the smallest creatures in it, and pulls carbon out of the sky. For decades, scientists had it exactly backwards. They thought whales ate the ocean's resources. It turns out the whales were feeding it. This is the story of how humpback whales came within a single generation of being wiped from the planet, how a near-total ban dragged them back from the edge, and what marine biologists are now discovering about the role these animals play. A role so counterintuitive that when the data first came in, the researchers assumed they had made a mistake. To understand the comeback, you first have to understand the slaughter. And the scale of it is genuinely difficult to hold in your head. People have hunted whales for thousands of years. Coastal communities in small open boats, taking one animal at a time, using every part of it. That kind of whaling barely dented the populations. The ocean was simply too vast, and the whales too many. What changed everything was technology, and it arrived in the second half of the 19th century. In the 1860s, a Norwegian named Sven Foyn perfected a harpoon with an explosive grenade fitted to its tip, fired from a cannon mounted on the bow of a steam-powered catcher boat. Suddenly, the fast, powerful whales that had always been able to outrun and outlast wooden sailing ships were within reach. Then came the factory ship, an enormous vessel with a ramp in the stern that could haul an entire whale on board and process it at sea, anywhere in the world, without ever returning to port. By the 1920s, fleets of these ships were steaming south into the Antarctic, into the richest whale waters on the planet, and they were killing on an industrial scale. The numbers are staggering. Over the course of the 20th century, an estimated 2.9 million whales were killed by commercial whaling, nearly 3 million animals. By sheer weight of biomass, it is very likely the single largest removal of wild animals from a single ecosystem in human history. Larger than the bison slaughter on the American plains. And we did it mostly out of sight, beyond the horizon, so almost nobody ever saw it happening. The whales were rendered down into oil for lamps and soap and margarine, their baleen cut up for corsets and umbrellas. An animal that had sung across the oceans for millions of years was being turned into household goods. And the humpback was one of the first to fall, because the humpback made itself easy to kill. It is a coastal animal for much of the year. It feeds in cold polar waters in summer, then migrates thousands of miles to warm, shallow tropical seas to breed, often hugging the coastline the whole way. It is slower than the great rorquals, the blue and the fin. It is curious, it lingers near boats, and crucially, unlike many whales, a dead humpback tends to float, which made it simple to harpoon and simple to recover. For a whaler, it was almost the perfect target. So the humpback was hammered first and hammered hardest. And because the fleets worked population by population, the local collapses were nearly total. That group off the coast of Brazil fell from roughly 27,000 animals to about 450. The humpbacks of the Antarctic feeding grounds were reduced to a few percent of what they had been. Around Australia, around New Zealand, in the North Pacific, the same story repeated over and over. By the early 1960s, the global humpback population, which may once have numbered 125,000 or more, had been driven down to perhaps 5,000 animals scattered across the world's oceans. That is what functional extinction looks like for a whale. Not gone, but so reduced, so scattered, that the species could no longer do what it was for. The singers fell silent across whole oceans. And then, slowly, almost too late, the killing stopped. The turning point came in stages. By the mid-1960s, it was obvious even to the whaling industry itself that the humpbacks were nearly finished. There were simply too few left to be worth hunting. In 1966, the International Whaling Commission gave humpbacks protection across the southern hemisphere, and commercial humpback whaling essentially ended. But protection on paper is not the same as enforcement. Through the 1960s and 70s, the Soviet Union ran a vast, secret, illegal whaling operation that killed tens of thousands of supposedly protected whales and falsified its records to hide it. The true toll, for decades, was worse than the official figures admitted. The real watershed came in 1982, when the IWC voted for a complete moratorium on commercial whaling worldwide, which came into force in 1986. For the first time in over a century, the great whales of the world were, with a handful of exceptions, no longer being commercially hunted. The harpoons went quiet. And here is where the story could so easily have ended, sadly. Because when you reduce a slow-breeding animal to a few hundred individuals, there is no guarantee it ever comes back. Humpbacks mature slowly. A female gives birth to a single calf, usually only once every 2 or 3 years. The populations had been shredded. Plenty of biologists feared that some of these groups were simply too small, too genetically narrow, too scattered to recover. They expected at best a long and fragile survival. What actually happened was something else entirely. The whales came roaring back. In 2019, a team of scientists led by Alex Zerbini published a study on that western South Atlantic population, the one off Brazil that had crashed to around 450 animals. They estimated it had recovered to nearly 25,000 whales, close to 93% of its original pre-whaling size. From the very brink of nothing, in a single human lifetime, back to almost exactly where it started. The researchers described it, with real wonder, as a rare and spectacular conservation success. And it was not just Brazil. Around eastern Australia, humpback numbers have been climbing at around 10% a year, close to the biological maximum the species can manage, rebuilding from a few hundred survivors into tens of thousands. In the North Pacific, populations have surged. In 2016, the United States government formally recognized the scale of the turnaround. Of 14 distinct humpback populations it tracks worldwide, it removed 9 of them from the endangered species list. Not because anyone had given up, but because they had genuinely, measurably recovered. Think about what that means. Within living memory, we drove these animals to the edge of extinction. And then, simply by stopping, by taking our harpoons out of the water and getting out of the way, we watched one of the largest animals on Earth rebuild itself, ocean by ocean. It is one of the great conservation comebacks in modern history, and most people have no idea it even happened. But the recovery of the whales is only half the story. The other half, the part that genuinely stunned scientists, is what those returning whales started doing to the ocean around them. For most of the history of whaling, and for a long time afterwards, people made a simple, intuitive assumption about whales. They assumed whales were competitors. A humpback eats well over a ton of food a day, krill and small fish scooped up by the mouthful. Multiply that across hundreds of thousands of whales, and it seems obvious. All those whales must be devouring a colossal share of the ocean's resources, resources that could otherwise go to fish, to other animals, to us. Whales, in this view, were giant mouths draining the sea. There was even a famous puzzle that seemed to confirm it, and then turned out to mean precisely the opposite. It is sometimes called the krill paradox. The logic went like this. In the Southern Ocean around Antarctica, whales eat enormous quantities of krill, the tiny shrimp-like creatures that form the base of the food web. So when industrial whaling wiped out most of the whales, there should have been a windfall, a krill surplus. Millions of tons of krill suddenly freed up because the animals that ate them were gone. The other krill eaters should have boomed. Instead, the opposite happened. After the whales were removed, krill numbers across large parts of the Southern Ocean did not rise. They collapsed. By some estimates, krill densities in parts of the Atlantic sector of the Southern Ocean have fallen by as much as 80% since the whaling era. Remove the animals that eat krill, and you end up with less krill. For decades, that made no sense at all. On its face, it was impossible. The answer to that paradox is the key to this entire story, and it comes down to a single, unglamorous word: iron. Here is what scientists eventually worked out. Vast areas of the open ocean, including much of the Southern Ocean, are what oceanographers call deserts, not because they lack sunlight or water, obviously, but because they lack one critical nutrient: iron. The microscopic plants that drift in the sunlit surface of the sea, the phytoplankton, need iron to grow, the same way a garden needs nitrogen. And in these high-nutrient parts of the ocean, there is barely any iron at the surface. It sinks. It falls down into the deep and is lost. So the phytoplankton are starved. And where the phytoplankton are thin, everything above them, the krill, the fish, the seabirds, is thin too. Now, where does a whale feed? It dives deep, often hundreds of meters down, into cold water rich in iron and nutrients, and it eats. And where does a whale do the other thing? Where does it release its waste? At the surface. Whales have to come up to breathe, and they release these enormous, buoyant plumes of feces right there in the sunlit surface waters. And whale feces are absolutely loaded with iron. By some measurements, around 10 million times the concentration of the surrounding seawater. Do you see what is happening? The whale is a pump. It dives down, harvests iron-rich food from the deep, and then carries that iron back up and releases it, in a form phytoplankton can use, exactly where they are starving for it. The marine biologists Joe Roman and James McCarthy gave this process its name. They called it the whale pump. The whales, it turned out, were fertilizing the surface of the ocean. And once you understand the whale pump, the krill paradox solves itself. The whales were never competing with the krill. They were feeding the system the krill depend on. Whale feces fertilize the phytoplankton. The phytoplankton feed the krill feed the whales, and the seals, and the penguins, and the fish. It is a loop, and the whales were closing it. Take the whales out, and the iron simply stops being recycled at the surface. It drains away into the deep. The phytoplankton thin, the krill crash, and the whole system runs down. The biologist Victor Smatachik put it memorably. The whales, he said, were not living off the krill. In a real sense, the krill were living off the whales. And the phytoplankton at the bottom of all this are not some minor detail. These microscopic ocean plants are the foundation of marine life on the entire planet. They also generate, through photosynthesis, an enormous share of the oxygen in our atmosphere. By many estimates, roughly half of every breath you take comes from phytoplankton in the sea, not from the forests on land. So when whales fertilize phytoplankton, they are, very literally, helping to make the oxygen that the rest of us breathe. And it gets better, because phytoplankton don't only make oxygen. They pull carbon dioxide out of the air. As they grow, they draw dissolved carbon into their bodies, and when they die, a portion of that carbon sinks down into the deep ocean and is locked away, sometimes for centuries. More whales means more phytoplankton, means more carbon drawn down out of the sky. The whales, by fertilizing the sea, are helping to fight the very thing that now threatens it. And the whale's own body is part of the story too. A great whale stores tons of carbon in its sheer mass over a long life, and a humpback can live to 90 or more. When it finally dies, if it dies a natural death, it does not release that carbon back into the air the way a dying tree does. It sinks. The carcass plummets to the deep sea floor and takes all that stored carbon down with it, far out of the atmosphere's reach. Scientists call this a whale fall, and it is not just a carbon store, it is a feast. A single dead whale on the seabed becomes an entire ecosystem, feeding deep-sea creatures, some of them found nowhere else on Earth, for decades. One body, decades of life. Researchers have even tried to put a price on all of this. A 2019 analysis by economists at the International Monetary Fund attempted to value the services a single great whale provides. The carbon capture, the boost to fisheries, the fertilizing of the sea, and arrived at a figure of over $2 million per whale. They argued that the great whales, allowed to recover to their old numbers, would be one of the most cost-effective carbon capture systems on the planet. Living, breathing, swimming climate infrastructure that builds and maintains itself for free. And there is one more layer, because whales don't only move nutrients up and down. They move them sideways, across entire oceans. Humpbacks feed in cold, productive polar waters, and then migrate thousands of miles to breed in warm tropical seas that are often nutrient poor. Along the way, and once they arrive, they release nutrients, through their waste, through birth, through the bodies of those that die, into waters that would otherwise be starved of them. Scientists have called this the Great Whale Conveyor Belt. The whales are a circulatory system for the sea, carrying fertility from the rich parts of the ocean to the poor ones, knitting the whole thing together. That is the process we very nearly switched off forever. And it is the process that is slowly, quietly coming back online as the whales return. Now, I want to be honest with you, the way the best of these stories always are, because the recovery is real, but it is not simple, and it is not finished. Not every population has bounced back. While the humpbacks off Brazil and Australia have soared, others are still struggling. And the humpback's close cousins tell a darker story. The North Atlantic right whale, hunted for the same centuries, has not recovered. There are only around 350 of them left, and they are still dying faster than they can breed, killed mainly by collisions with ships and entanglement in fishing gear. And those two threats, ships and ropes, now hang over the humpbacks as well. As the whales have recovered, and as our oceans have grown busier, the number struck by vessels and tangled in fishing lines has climbed. Along the United States East Coast, an unusual mortality event declared in 2016 has involved the deaths of well over 100 humpbacks, many showing the unmistakable signs of vessel strikes. Then there is the warming ocean itself, which is shifting where the krill and the fish can be found. And there is a growing commercial krill fishing industry in the Southern Ocean, hoovering up the very animals at the base of this whole system, competing, this time for real, with the recovering whales. So this is not a tidy victory. It is a fragile, hard-won, still contested recovery. But here is the thing I keep coming back to. We have already proven the most important part. We proved that if you stop killing them, they come back. We proved that the ocean knows exactly what to do with a whale the moment you give it one. The hard, slow, expensive work of recovery turned out to be the part we did not have to do at all. We just had to stop. And the whales did the rest. Step back and look at the whole shape of it. A century of slaughter that killed nearly 3 million whales and brought the humpback to the very edge. A near-total ban that almost came too late. And then a recovery so strong that we have taken these animals off the endangered list, ocean by ocean. But the deepest lesson is not in the numbers. It is in how completely wrong we were about what a whale actually is. For most of our history, we looked at a whale and saw a resource. Barrels of oil, tons of meat, a mouth that ate our fish. We were precisely backwards. The whale is not a drain on the ocean. The whale is one of the engines that runs it. It fertilizes the sea. It feeds the smallest life within it. It pulls carbon out of the sky. And it carries fertility from the poles to the tropics across thousands of miles of open water. When we nearly destroyed the whales, we were quietly starving the ocean itself. And every humpback that surfaces today, every plume it leaves behind, every calf born off the coast of Brazil, is the ocean slowly switching that engine back on. We did not engineer this recovery. We did not design it or manage it or pour fortunes into it. We simply, finally, got out of the way. And one of the largest animals that has ever lived went back to doing what it has done for millions of years. Feeding the sea that the rest of us depend on. If this story moved you the way it moves me, let me know in the comments. Tell me, did you have any idea that whales fertilize the ocean and pull carbon out of the air? And do you think we are doing enough now to protect them from the ships and the nets? Or are we about to make the very same mistake twice? If it changed the way you think about these animals, share it with someone who would appreciate it. And subscribe, because there are more of these comeback stories out there than you would ever believe. And I have got plenty more to tell you. Thanks for watching.